I want to put a great example of what the game is for the fans and the young people that come and watch. Like, I think that's really important, and I take that seriously. So hopefully we do that in a decent manner. I think we can continue to improve as we move forward.
Caitlin Clark just said something about the WNBA All-Star game that nobody with her institutional standing in this league has ever had the courage to say publicly, and the basketball world is erupting because when the most commercially significant player in the history of women's professional basketball looks directly into the camera after the league's mid-season showcase and tells the public that the fans were scammed, every institutional actor connected to the All-Star event, every player who participated in it, and every organizational stakeholder in the WNBA's commercial relationships has to reckon with what it means that this specific person said those specific words, in that specific way, at this specific moment. Today I am breaking down exactly what Clark said about the All-Star performance, and why the specific language she chose, "fans were scammed," represents the most direct and the most institutionally consequential individual accountability statement any active WNBA player has made about the quality of the league's own marquee event. What the specific complaints she raised about the All-Star performance reveal about the gap between what the WNBA's most commercially significant showcase should be and what it actually produced, why her decision to call out specific players by implication rather than simply criticizing the event in general terms is the element of her statement that the basketball world is processing with the most intensity, and what the institutional consequences of this level of public accountability from this specific source mean for how the WNBA approaches every future All-Star format decision. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark, I am going to show you the specific element of the All-Star performance that most directly validates Clark's "fans were scammed" characterization, and that the mainstream coverage has been treating as a minor production issue, when it is actually the most fundamental competitive and entertainment failure of the entire event. The WNBA All-Star game has always occupied a specific and somewhat complicated position in the league's commercial calendar. It is the mid-season showcase that every major professional sports league uses to demonstrate its product at its most entertaining and its most commercially accessible to audiences that include the casual fans, whose engagement drives the commercial metrics most relevant to the league's business relationships. It is supposed to be the event where the best players in the sport perform at the level of individual brilliance and collective entertainment that reminds everyone who watches it why they invested in this sport in the first place. It is supposed to generate the kind of moments, the highlight sequences, the competitive exchanges, the individual brilliance in concentrated form that drive the social media engagement, the broadcast ratings, and the cultural conversation that the league's commercial partners are most directly interested in when they evaluate the return on their investment in women's basketball. What the most recent WNBA All-Star game produced instead is what Clark described as a scam, and the specific nature of what she means by that word in this context is the analytical foundation of everything that follows. A scam is not simply a disappointing performance or a substandard competitive event. A scam is specifically a situation in which people who paid money or time or emotional investment were given something that did not match what they were told they were purchasing, and Clark's choice of that specific word, rather than the more diplomatically available alternatives, tells you exactly how she is characterizing the gap between what the All-Star event promised and what it delivered to the people who invested in it on the basis of that promise. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the word itself and into the specific All-Star performance failures that Clark's characterization is pointing toward. Let us start with what the All-Star performance actually produced, because the specific competitive and entertainment failures of the event are the evidence base for Clark's scam characterization, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the event as simply disappointing when the specific nature of what went wrong reveals something much more systemic about how the All-Star format is currently designed and executed. The All-Star game is supposed to be the setting where the competitive creativity and individual brilliance of the best players in the sport is expressed in its most concentrated and most immediately accessible form. What the most recent event produced was a competitive environment so devoid of genuine competitive engagement, so thoroughly defined by the kind of performative effort that makes the players visible without making them genuinely present in the competitive moment, that the audience watching it had the specific experience of watching elite athletes going through motions rather than engaging in the kind of authentic competitive expression that makes elite athletics worth watching. The defensive effort, or more accurately the absence of it, was the most immediately visible element of the competitive failure. Professional all-star games in every major sport struggle with defensive effort, and the WNBA is not unique in this challenge. But the specific degree of defensive absence in this event was severe enough that the offensive production it allowed, while statistically impressive in isolation, was contextually meaningless as a demonstration of offensive skill, because it was achieved against competition that was not making any genuine attempt to prevent it. Elite shooting is compelling to watch specifically because of the difficulty involved in producing it against genuine defensive resistance. Elite shot creation is compelling because it requires solving a genuine defensive puzzle in real time. When the defensive puzzle is not being assembled because the defensive players have collectively agreed not to assemble it, what remains is not a demonstration of offensive skill, but a demonstration of offensive mechanics in the absence of the competitive context that makes those mechanics meaningful. Clark watched that, and she said the fans were scammed, and she was not wrong. Now let us talk about Clark calling out specific players by implication, because this is the element of her statement that is generating the most intense processing from the basketball world, and that reveals the most about what she is actually saying underneath the diplomatically framed surface of her public statement. Clark did not name names in the traditional sense of delivering explicit individual criticism of specific players by their names and specific actions. But she structured her public statement about the All-Star performance in a way that makes the implicit target of the accountability she is assigning clear to anyone who watched the event with adequate attention to which players were most visibly engaged in the performative, rather than genuine competitive effort that defined the overall tone. The specific way she characterized the competitive engagement failure of the event, the language she used to describe what was absent, and the specific contrasts she drew between what the event should have been and what it was, all of these things together constitute an implicit accountability statement that is directed not at the format or the organization in isolation, but at the players who participated in the event and whose collective decision-making about competitive engagement produced the outcome Clark is characterizing as a scam on the people who paid to watch it. The basketball world is processing the implicit accountability direction of Clark's statement with particular intensity because it raises the specific question of who Clark is talking about when she talks about the players whose engagement level failed the fans. And the answer to that question in the context of the specific competitive dynamics of the All-Star event creates a set of interpersonal and institutional tensions that the league's management apparatus is going to have to navigate carefully. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the implicit accountability direction of Clark's statement and into what her willingness to make that statement at all reveals about her current relationship with the league's institutional culture. Now let us talk about what Clark's willingness to say fans were scammed about the WNBA's own marquee event reveals about her current institutional relationship with the league, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is not examining with adequate depth. Players in professional sports leagues who have a strong institutional alignment with the league that governs their professional lives do not characterize the league's own flagship events as scams in public statements. The institutional relationship that produces that kind of public accountability statement is one in which the player has made a specific assessment that the institutional culture of the league she competes in is not adequately serving the people whose commercial engagement makes the league commercially viable, and that the personal and professional cost of staying silent about that inadequacy is greater than the personal and professional cost of saying what she actually thinks about it publicly. Clark's fans were scammed statement is the product of exactly that specific institutional assessment and the specific moment she chose to make it, in the immediate aftermath of an All-Star event that she assessed as having failed the fans in a specific and documentable way, is itself a communication about her current relationship with the WNBA's institutional culture that is as significant as the specific content of what she said. Think about the institutional positioning required to make this specific statement. Clark is not simply a disgruntled former employee with nothing to lose. She is an active WNBA player under contract, the most commercially significant active player in the league's history, and the player whose commercial relationships most directly fund the commercial infrastructure that makes the league's institutional apparatus financially sustainable. When someone in that specific institutional position says the fans were scammed about the league's own marquee event, the institutional weight of the statement is categorically different from the same statement made by any other available source, and the league's institutional management has to engage with it differently than it would engage with criticism from any less commercially and institutionally significant source. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Clark's public statement about the All-Star performance is not simply an event quality critique or an individual accountability story. It is the latest and most institutionally directed expression of a broader pattern of public accountability that Clark has been building throughout this season. A pattern that reflects a specific and developing relationship with her own institutional voice, and with the specific responsibilities that her commercial standing gives her in relation to the sport's institutional health. The "fans were scammed" statement is connected to every previous moment in which Clark has chosen public honesty over institutional diplomacy, from the named official statement that generated a fine and a disciplinary response, to the organizational accountability that her departure announcement communicated about what a professional basketball franchise owes its most important player, to the NBC announcement that used her individual commercial power to reshape her relationship with the league's broadcast infrastructure. All of these things together reveal a player who has made a deliberate and sustained decision that the commercial significance she carries in this sport comes with a specific responsibility to use her public voice to hold the institutions that govern the sport to the standards those institutions claim to be operating by, and whose assessment of when the gap between the claimed standards and the actual conduct is large enough to require public accountability has been calibrated throughout this season by the specific failures that the season has documented. The All-Star event's failure to deliver what was promised to the fans who invested in it crossed whatever threshold Clark has established for when that specific kind of institutional gap requires her specific kind of public accountability, and the "fans were scammed" statement is the result of that threshold being crossed. Remember the specific All-Star performance failure I mentioned at the start? Here it is. The single moment in the All-Star event that most directly validates Clark's characterization is the specific defensive sequence in the second half, where multiple All-Star caliber defenders whose professional defensive capabilities are documented across entire seasons of competitive performance were making no genuine attempt to contest shots that in any regular season game would have been among the most contested and the most carefully defended possessions of the night. That specific sequence is the scam Clark is describing, the moment when the audience watching understood that what they were watching was not a demonstration of elite basketball performance, but a performance of the demonstration, and the gap between those two things is exactly the gap that the word scam describes. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about Clark's statement, and why it matters beyond the immediate controversy it has generated. The specific institutional dynamic between Clark's public accountability statement and the players she is implicitly calling out creates a competitive and interpersonal landscape that is going to shape the social and competitive environment of the league in ways that extend well beyond the All-Star controversy itself. When the most commercially significant player in the league's history publicly characterizes the collective competitive engagement of her peers in the league's most prominent showcase event as a scam on the people who paid to see them compete, she is making a statement about professional standards and professional responsibility that every other player in the league has to engage with in terms of how it applies to their own conduct and their own understanding of what they owe the audience that sustains the commercial infrastructure their professional lives depend on. The implicit accountability direction of Clark's statement is not simply a critique of specific players. It is a statement about the professional culture of the league, about what elite athletes in women's basketball owe the fans whose commercial engagement they depend on, and about the specific standards of competitive authenticity that the league's most commercially significant event should be designed to produce and enforce. The second hidden angle that nobody in the mainstream coverage is discussing is the specific effect Clark's statement is going to have on the WNBA's internal conversations about All-Star format and competitive structure in the planning process for future events. A public characterization of the All-Star game as a scam from the league's most commercially significant player is not a comment that the people responsible for the event's design and execution can treat as one perspective among many. It is a commercial and institutional accountability statement that requires a specific response in the form of the format and competitive structure changes that would prevent the same characterization from being accurately applied to future events. My verdict on Clark's fans were scammed statement, and what it means is this, stated without qualification. Caitlin Clark calling out players and exposing the WNBA over the embarrassing All-Star performance with the specific language of fans were scammed is the most institutionally significant public accountability statement any active WNBA player has made about the competitive quality of the league's own marquee event. And it reflects a specific and genuine responsibility that her commercial standing gives her in relation to the sport's institutional health that she is exercising in the most direct and the most honest form available to her. The first reason this verdict is correct is the accuracy of the characterization. The specific competitive and entertainment failures of the All-Star event that Clark's statement is pointing toward are real, documented in the broadcast footage, and experienced by the audience whose commercial engagement the league depends on in exactly the terms her fans were scammed language describes. The second reason is the institutional necessity of the statement. Professional sports leagues do not improve their marquee events through the absence of accountability. They improve them through the specific accountability that forces the people responsible for the event's design and execution to engage honestly with the gap between what they promised and what they delivered. And Clark's public statement creates exactly that accountability in a form that the institutional communications apparatus cannot manage away through the standard responses it applies to less commercially credible sources of criticism. The third reason is the broader professional culture statement it makes. By implicitly calling out the competitive engagement level of All-Star participants, Clark is asserting a professional standard about what elite athletes owe the fans whose commercial investment sustains their professional lives, and the assertion of that standard from this specific source creates a public accountability for meeting it that the absence of the statement would not have produced. The strongest counter-argument is that All-Star games in every professional league are understood by players and sophisticated fans alike to be entertainment exhibitions rather than genuine competitive events, and that characterizing the competitive disengagement of All-Star participants as a scam applies a competitive standard to an entertainment format that the format was not designed to meet. That argument has genuine merit as a format characterization. The counter to the counter is that the WNBA All-Star game is specifically marketed and sold to fans as a showcase of elite competitive performance, rather than explicitly as a non-competitive exhibition, and the gap between that specific marketing promise and the specific competitive product delivered is precisely what Clark's scam language is describing. So tell me in the comments right now, do you agree with Clark that the fans were scammed by the All-Star performance? And do you think players in the WNBA All-Star game have a professional responsibility to compete with genuine effort, regardless of the entertainment exhibition format of the event? Drop your answer, because this question is splitting the basketball world between people who believe elite athletes always owe their audience genuine competitive effort, and people who believe the All-Star format creates a legitimate space for performative entertainment rather than genuine competition. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the WNBA announces specific format changes to the All-Star game competitive structure within 60 days of Clark's statement that are explicitly designed to address the competitive engagement failures her fans were scammed characterization identified, including specific incentive structures or competitive format elements that align the players' competitive interests with the audience's interest in genuine competitive engagement rather than performative exhibition. High confidence because the institutional accountability pressure created by a public scam characterization from the league's most commercially significant active player is qualitatively different from the standard audience disappointment with All-Star game quality that leagues typically manage through format adjustments at their own pace. And the commercial stakes of having the league's most commercially significant showcase characterized as a scam make the format response more urgent than any previous All-Star quality criticism has made it. Second prediction: at least one of the players implicitly called out by Clark's statement responds publicly in a way that either defends the competitive engagement level of the All-Star event in terms that the audience has clearly rejected, or acknowledges the legitimate basis of Clark's criticism in a way that reflects genuine awareness of the professional responsibility her statement is asserting. And the specific form of the response tells you more about the competitive culture of the league than any institutional communication about All-Star format changes could. Medium confidence, because public responses to implicit accountability from individual players in the same league are common, but the specific direction those responses take is genuinely uncertain and depends on individual assessments of the professional and interpersonal costs of engaging with or ignoring the accountability Clark's statement has created. Third prediction, and this is the bold one. Clark's "fans were scammed" statement becomes the specific catalyst for a formal collective bargaining conversation between the Players Association and the league about the competitive standards that apply to All-Star game participation, and about whether those standards should be formalized in the collective bargaining agreement in a way that creates specific enforceable obligations about competitive engagement rather than simply cultural expectations about professional responsibility. Low confidence on the specific mechanism and timeline, because collective bargaining conversations involve complexity and process that make specific predictions about their direction and their content genuinely uncertain. But the institutional significance of Clark's public accountability statement and the professional responsibility argument it makes create more favorable conditions for exactly this kind of formal collective bargaining engagement than any previous All-Star quality criticism in this league's history has produced. Remember that defensive sequence detail? The specific broadcast footage of the defensive engagement failures that most directly validates Clark's scam characterization is the evidentiary foundation that every institutional response to her statement has to engage with, rather than treating her criticism as simply subjective disappointment with the event's entertainment quality. Watch for 3 things specifically going forward. First, track the WNBA's official response to Clark's statement, and specifically whether any part of that response acknowledges the specific competitive engagement failures she identified, or whether the institutional response treats her criticism as a matter of individual perspective about entertainment preferences, rather than as a specific and documentable account of the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Second, watch the player community's response to Clark's implicit accountability direction, and specifically whether the competitive culture conversation her statement has initiated produces any visible change in the public discourse among players about what they owe the fans whose commercial engagement sustains their professional lives. Because any such change would be evidence that Clark's public accountability statement has produced the professional culture impact that institutional communications about competitive standards typically fail to create. Third, watch how the All-Star format conversation evolves in the WNBA's institutional planning process, and specifically, whether any format changes that emerge from that conversation are explicitly connected to the accountability Clark's statement created, or whether the institutional response frames format changes as the product of the league's own ongoing evaluation process, rather than as a response to the specific criticism her "fans were scammed" language produced. In my next video, I am going deep on what a genuinely competitive and genuinely entertaining WNBA All-Star format would need to look like to justify the commercial investment fans make in attending and watching the event, and to produce the kind of competitive authenticity that Clark's statement is asserting the audience has a right to receive when they invest in the league's most prominent showcase event. The single most important thing Caitlin Clark saying the fans were scammed about the WNBA All-Star performance tells us is that the most commercially significant player in the history of women's professional basketball has made a specific and public assessment that the league's own marquee event failed the people whose commercial engagement sustains the league's commercial infrastructure. And that assessment, from that specific source, creates an institutional accountability that every subsequent All-Star format decision will be evaluated against in a way that no previous criticism of All-Star quality in this league's history has created with comparable commercial and institutional weight. Subscribe to Street Hoops for the coverage that takes the fans' investment in this sport as seriously as the players and the institutions, and that holds every element of the commercial proposition. Women's basketball offers its audience to the standard of honesty that the audience's investment deserves. And tell me in the comments, do you agree with Clark that the fans were scammed? And what specific change to the All-Star format would most directly address the competitive engagement failure she identified in a way that would prevent the same characterization from being accurately applied to the next one? Drop your answer right now, because I am reading every single one.